Welcome to session C-2, Assessment Reporting in Peer Review. My name is Josa. I'm a program officer here at the Department of Education. And this session will focus on the requirements for assessment reporting as found in the updated guide. I'd like to welcome all of you as well as our viewers online. The ESSA added several new requirements for assessment reporting, and most states missed at least one part of this critical element, element 6.4, in the 2016-2017 peer reviews. Peers will discuss the evidence needed to address all critical elements for peer review and focus on items most commonly missed by states in submitting this information. This session will specifically address critical element 6.4, as I said earlier, of the updated guide, which starts on page 70. So since we're going to 6.4, I'll just read the critical element, and you guys could follow along and read the examples of evidence if you prefer. So critical element 6.4. Reporting examples of evidence. The state reports its assessment results for all students assessed, and the reporting facilitates timely, appropriate, credible, and defensible interpretations and uses of those results by parents, educators, state officials, policymakers, and other stakeholders, and the public. The state reports to the public its assessment results on 1. Student academic achievement for all students and each student group at each achievement level, and 2, English language proficiency for all English learners, including the number and percentage of ELs attaining ELP, or English language proficiency. For academic content assessments, the state reports assessment results, including itemized score analyses, to districts and schools so that parents, teachers, principals, and administrators can interpret the results and address the specific academic needs of students. And the state also provides interpretive guides to support appropriate uses of the assessment results. The state provides for the production and delivery of individual student interpretive, descriptive, and diagnostic reports after each administration of its academic content assessments that provide valid and reliable information regarding a student's academic achievement, report the student's academic achievement in terms of the state's grade level academic achievement standards, provide information to help parents, teachers, and principals interpret the test results and address the specific academic needs of students, are provided in an understandable and uniform format. We're almost done here. 3 more bullets. Are, to the extent practicable, written in a language that parents and guardians can understand, or if it is not practicable to provide written translations to a parent or guardian with limited English proficiency, are orally translated for such parent or guardian. Upon request by a parent who is an individual with a disability as defined by the ADA as amended, are provided in an alternative format accessible to that parent. And finally, the state allows or follows a process and timeline for delivering individual student reports to parents, teachers, and principals as soon as practicable after each test administration. So that's a lot, but not too much, but a lot of examples of evidence as well that you could follow along that go on. I'll introduce our panel because that's what you're here for, to hear their invaluable insights and expertise, and we have a great panel with us today. First, we have Vince Vergis. Vince is Assistant Deputy Commissioner at the Florida Department of Education. He has served in Florida's public education system for 26 years as a high school mathematics teacher, adjunct college mathematics instructor, elementary school assistant principal, and now he oversees Florida's K-12 and post-secondary assessment systems. Thanks for joining us, Vince. To his immediate left is Will Laurie. Dr. William Laurie is a psychometrician currently serving as independent consultant to the Department of Education and other organizations. He has held business development, senior scientist, and technical advisory positions at McGraw-Hill, ETS, the World Bank, and Pearson, working on large-scale testing programs in the US and abroad. He designed the first national mathematics and science test given in the state of Qatar, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and was awarded a Department of Defense contract to develop and validate proficiency tests for 9 strategic languages. Most recently, Will developed an algorithm for sub-score-free diagnostic reporting and a method for standardizing the scoring of technology-enhanced test items. This year, he was awarded a Small Business Innovation Research Grant through the Institute for Education Sciences to develop an AI system for helping English language learners improve their conversational skills. Thanks so much for joining us again, Will. And finally, we have Lou. Dr. Lou Fabrizio currently serves as a CEO for Fabrizio Education Consulting, LLC, after his retirement on February 1st, 2018, from the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, NCDPI, with over 24 years of experience. His most recent title at the NCDPI was Federal Policy Director, where he served as a point person for the state's plan under the Every Student Succeeds Act. He previously served in positions including the Director of Data, Research, and Federal Policy, and as the Director of Accountability Services, overseeing the state's testing and accountability programs. He also worked for nearly 15 years for a major test publishing company and has served on several national committees and boards, including the National Assessment Governing Board, which sets policy for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. He has a BS in Physics from Georgetown, an MS in Education Administration and Supervision, and a PhD in Educational Research and Policy Analysis, both from the North Carolina State University in Raleigh. Thanks again. For this panel, that's a lot. You could read it, the bios in your packets, but also I think they'll be provided on our website. So let's dive into the questions. The first question that we have is, what kind of narrative from states would you suggest accompany the evidence for this particular critical element? And that's open to any one of the panelists.
I say the senior statesman go first.
Everyone's so polite. Oh, yes.
Let me also stand up here. I would say the most important thing from the ones that I've read, and I'm sorry, I see one person I can't see. Hey, so only one person I can't see, and I know him. I would say that generally we see states that are in transition need the most narrative. I reviewed one state that had a nice stable assessment system, just hadn't come in for peer review for a long time. Their reports always looked the same. Nothing really new. Two other states had gone through some serious transitions, and the narrative that they both provided explained, for example, one assessment system was getting ready to transition and talked about some provisional reports and really gave a good in-depth explanation of what had happened. And then one state's report was in a final or a semi-final transition, and there was some. I'll talk about standard setting, and that's they were looking to apply some standards. And I'm trying to verbalize this without identifying the state, right? So the report were not what I would think would be a great report, but once the explanation was applied, it was clear that this was a transitional report. The state, for whatever reason, had been called to come in for peer review, and they gave good, solid reasoning as to why the report wasn't, in its final state. I think the other thing, I think this is the area that maybe, every area is subject to policy and budget and legislative action. I think reporting, from what I saw and what we experienced in Florida, is another area. I'll give you an example for Florida. For years, we had a nice color 4-page report, had all the bells and whistles, everything on here that you see in 6.4 plus some. Then the recession hit in 2008, and legislators said, you don't have any money, make do with what you have, and we dropped down to 1 page. Then we had new legislators and new budget a couple of years ago, and they said, this report's terrible, it doesn't have anything. So then about $1.2 million later, just for ELA mathematics, we added those pages back. So if you've got those kinds of budget and policy constraints, another one I'll say is what your achievement level descriptors say. I think there's some language in there that maybe assessment directors aren't the most excited about, but your policymakers and the law says your reports shall say this. It helps to know that. So it helps to know, what the pressure points are. Is there something that was an omission, or is this purposeful, or is this just an oversight? So I think again, explanations about your specific constraints and your transition timelines on your reports has been very helpful for me as a peer reviewer. So
the only thing that I would add to what Vince just said is there was one state that I reviewed that it had a PowerPoint attachment. Can't hear?
analysis for now. Yeah. Long.
Test. Okay, how about now? There you go.
There was one state where they were asked to provide information on, how they did training for test administrators. And in going through that PowerPoint, I read this really beautiful explanation of why the state was doing what it was doing, but that wasn't anywhere else in their submission. And that would have been a perfect example of the narrative that Vince was just talking about. So make it easier for the peer reviewers to get the big picture of what's going on in the state whenever you can.
So the second question is, should states submit supplementary evidence beyond what is necessary to demonstrate that the assessments meet requirements? Is less is more, or throwing everything?
Please, no. I've seen submissions that have a lot of evidence for not just this critical element, but other critical elements, and not all of it is relevant, not all of it is necessary or really targeted to that critical element. It taxes one's patience, but one has to be very conscientious and really consider everything that's there. And so we in our responses, we might not address all of the evidence that has been presented. We might just write about one or address just one or two pieces that we think were critical, but it really does help us if you're selective about the evidence that addresses that particular critical element. So I mean, that's all I have to say about that.
Okay. So this one's for Lou. Must a state submit copies of every single report per grade and subject, do you think?
Okay, this is one where the U.S. Department of Ed has already said that they're going to need to maybe do a little bit of clarifying on it, because in the guidance and in the information that we got on the new guidance with the critical elements, in the introductory section, it makes the comment that if your reports are basically the same within a grade span, like 3 through 5, then you just need to give one example of that and say that it's similar grades 3 through 5. But then in the critical elements section, it specifically says that you have to submit information by grade and subject. So there is some inconsistency. I did point it out to Don, and Deborah is aware of it as well, and they are going to provide more clarification. To be on the safe side, you can always just, have a screenshot, or not a screenshot, but an example of every grade and subject, and then you're in the clear. But it's just a little aggravating when you could make it a little bit easier for us and for everyone. But we'll have to sort of wait and see how they finally land, or where they finally land on that particular issue.
Great. Awesome, thank you. And number 4 was, how should states address reporting category size for subcategories in their submissions? And I think, Vince, you might have a...
Yeah, and this is a bit of a change that was actually from another. The original question was from another. That was from another session. So, I saw a couple of reports, and there's also the element in there that talks about itemized item analysis, and so I think we had a lot of questions as a state as to what that means. Because we don't want to. I mean, really, it's not appropriate to dig in. This is not a diagnostic assessment. So. We took this to mean, and I think we kind of work with the department to work on that, to make sure that when we say things about reporting categories, that's really what we're looking at. So reporting category size, that we're able to defend that not just in the reports. That also goes back to the validity section. So you look at your correlation among reporting categories and even across subject areas to make sure that you can point to the evidence that talks about the reporting categories that you put out there are of appropriate size. I'll also bring another a state. I'll try to do this without identifying the state. There was a state that had a reporting category that was very small and included topics that were seemingly unrelated to each other. And when you look at it, you'd say, wow, this is a tiny category, and why are these things together? But the narrative provided some good evidence that the legislators required these topics to be included on a test, when you might say, maybe this isn't the greatest place to put this topic, but it's there. And they said, you've got to report out in a category. So the state decided they did the best they could, and they put these topics together and reported out. So the correlations were not as strong because it was so small. They were not as strong as some of the other reporting categories because of the size, but they did their due diligence and did the best that they could. And so for the agreement among the panelists was that it was acceptable given the constraints, and had they not explained it well, it would have just led to back and forth and possibly a not approval for that section.
The word itemized appears in the guidance, and it's repeated in the examples of evidence that could be submitted. It's in the law, right? And just speaking as for myself as a peer reviewer, I've never been in a panel where we interpreted itemized to mean strictly item by item. So, and I don't think that that's what's meant. At least I wouldn't interpret it that way. And again, I'm just speaking for myself. Itemized could mean by subscore or by different reporting categories or different student groups, and so I just wanted to kind of clarify that that they're not asking for item by item or anything that that detailed.
Yeah. Likewise, with Will, I have never been part of a panel that was looking for an item-by-item analysis. To me, that usually only makes sense if you're going to be releasing the test form or releasing the forms of the test after the administration, so that schools could, in fact, start looking at statewide data or local data item by item. But there's nothing in the law that implies that states must be releasing test forms or any of that kind of stuff. So that's a issue that does usually come up among state test directors.
Great. In terms of, in the law, there are various provisions about parent and family engagement, parents' right to know. How can a state how are states meeting the requirement to provide these score reports or other reports that parents can understand in a uniform and understandable format to the extent practicable? There's all these words and phrases throughout the law that touch on parents and guardians and making sure that the reports of students are in languages that they can understand and interpret. How do states meet this particular requirement?
Again, this is where, and I've had the good fortune of reviewing submissions that actually do a good job of this. There's no way that you can fit everything on the report. And as long as what folks are providing are links, like for example in Florida we have something called Understanding FSA reports, Florida Standards Assessment Reports, and it accompanies the document. So when parents go on there, they can click the link and it takes them to a document that really does a deep dive that you can't do on the real estate that you have for the report. I saw that carried out on all the states that I reviewed. There's some clear link that accompanies the document that parents can go to find out more about the information. There have been other things where a state may, and this is kind of that extraneous evidence, where they say, we also have this other thing over here. But to me, it wasn't clear. They had satisfied the requirement with the link. The other thing they provided was something that parents couldn't easily get to. You wouldn't be able to find it, or it was for educators only. And if you've got something that's for educators only, that's fine if it's on the report, but state that. Or if you send out something separate to educators, that's okay to state that, because that helps contribute to the evidence. but it's not necessarily tied to the report itself.
Yes, and it's important for parents and guardians to know that these alternate formats are available. So in addition to having them available through links, for example, it's one of the things that in panels I've been in we look for is, were parents informed? Where is the evidence that they know that they can call this number, or that they can watch this video that explains the report? So that's an element to, or an aspect of this critical element to really consider. And if you do have links in the evidence, make sure that they're still working. I've been on panels where we referred to online sites that may not have the information that they're that the index claims or the submission claims that they have. So that's something to just make sure you have that.
All right. So we've already heard a few of us mentioning links, and in the guidance there is a section I think that says you're not supposed to really be using links as your evidence. So that's another area where there may need to be a little bit of clarification. What I've heard Don Peasley say is the states really should be providing documents and not links as their primary evidence for the peer review submission, but they can then say for additional information you can then go to this link. And then I've also known some peer reviewers that have just flat out said, I don't ever go to a link because they're not supposed to be using, states are not supposed to be using links. So with some of the information that Will was just talking about, so a parent gets a parent report and then there's a link to a document, well, what I would advise you as states to do is send us the copy of the report and then send us a document of what you would get if you did click on that link and read that extra explanation that goes to the parent. The other thing that I understand that the U.S. Department of Ed is going to be asking us to take a little bit closer look at is that issue of providing information to parents in a language that is not English for those parents that can't read English. And so I think it would behoove states to start talking with LEAs that have large populations of non-English speaking parents to maybe collaborate in terms of translating some of the reports that go to parents into the native language that's most often spoken in that particular LEA or in that particular state. Because I think that's the thing that the U.S. Department of Ed is hearing, that they're hearing, I guess, from clienteles across the country. It does no good for a parent who doesn't speak English to read that if they can't read this, they can ask for something in their native language. Well, if you can't read it, you're not going to know that. So figuring out ways to get that kind of message across is something that I think the states need to spend some time thinking about.
Yeah, and also in terms of links, I know in grant competitions or pilot program applications, one reason why links are discouraged is because you could change what's provided in that link at a later time and we wouldn't really know. And in terms of, we know that states, in the second question, we talked about should states submit supplementary evidence beyond what is necessary, like throw the whole kitchen sink in and hope something sticks approach. And that obviously is discouraged, but if states do happen to submit links, even though they're discouraged by the peers, make sure that they're targeted. And you could specifically point to what portion of that 1 hour video they should be looking at, anything to help the peers. But that's, yeah, I don't know if peers agree or if they disagree with that. Okay. Moving on to the next question. How can a state that does not release items or test forms after the assessment period is completed address the requirement for itemized score analysis? And I think, Lou, you talked about that recently. So I just wanted to make sure if that was completely addressed. Moving on to, does a state have to include each of the individual school and LEA timetables or schedules for the release of testing data to parents if each LEA sets its own schedules with their parameters established by the state? And I know, Lou, this was one of your questions, and maybe in terms of response, take a stab at it.
Well, one of the perennial issues has to do with states saying, you know, here are our rules, but then we never know, does the state do checking when they do monitoring to see that reports went home to parents within 30 days of when they received the test results back, those kinds of things. And I know that some states may say, you know, you have 30 days within which to send your reports home, but all school districts, many school districts may have different starting times and ending times, and so it's hard to give a calendar that says this is when they're required to send it home if every LEA could potentially have something different. And so it's just something for you to think about. I believe the U.S. Department of Ed has no issue with the state saying, here are the rules that we have put together that the school districts are supposed to follow, but you've got to then be able to address, are you checking to see that the LEAs are in fact following it? So that's the main point with that particular question.
Right, and if the timetable or the parameters provided were not met in a particular case, or that if they were met, it would be good for you to let us know. You know, for 2016, for example, that all LEAs met these parameters. They delivered the reports according to our timetable, with the exception of one, let's say, and they were 3 days late or whatever it was. That kind of assertion helps us make that link, you know, between what your rules are and what actually happened, and helps us assess the standing with respect to the critical element.
This final question, in terms of like what should a state do if its legislator determines that the total time allowed for testing and determines that, and it limits the number of assessment items that can be administered within that time, that total time?
Yeah, you can take that.
Yeah, just so you're all figuring this stuff out, we had all been asked as the panelists to come up with questions that we thought you all might have. And so this was another one that I had come up with. I've read on occasion how a particular state's legislature will, you know, pass a law that says you can only have X number of minutes of testing per subject. Well, that's sort of not the best way to go about making decisions about how many items you should have on the test and all that stuff. And so those are the kinds of things where the states that have those particular nuanced situations need to make sure you explain that to the peer reviewers, because I get a little nervous when I see somebody claiming that their test has 18 items and then they're giving all of these reports, and then there's never any mention of the reliability of any of this stuff. And you know, I feel like there should be some comments made in the submission about what the TAC from that state said about that particular issue, and because those are the kinds of things that I think we sometimes try to fulfill the perpetual desire of many parents, students, principals, and legislatures of, you know, they want a test that takes 10 minutes to administer, that has 10 test questions, and gives you 10 pages of diagnostic information. And, you know, it doesn't exist. And that's why it behooves the state, if you have the legislature passing laws that do certain things, that you then are able to quantify what the impact of that is in terms of the reliability of your assessment instrument and those types of things.
guess a question of my own would be just some of the overarching questions. Like, what do you see states doing well in their submissions, or what would you see a state submit that you would recommend meets this particular requirement? Or on the flip side, are there any submissions that you would see and hope that additional information was provided? What's the most commonly missed item in this critical element in terms of submissions? So what they do well, what they do poorly in general.
And again, I've fortunately been part of a group that's seen, really, really good submissions as far as reporting or clear what the issues are. I would like to take the opportunity to talk about some things that I, as a state, am going to look at. So we are in a transition. We had the one-page report that we submitted. We weren't ready for our big $1.2 million 4-page report. So that's what we'll be able to submit. So we think that that'll meet the requirements. Also, we know that there are the states that out there, I keep talking about the ones that have met peer review in all the areas. So I'll look at my friend Tammy in North Carolina, looked at those reports. Park states have generally met the requirements, and park reports are readily available online. So I went and dug in looking at the park reports, the sample park reports, and said, does our report have this? Does our report have that? Does our report? So if park met requirements, then I'm good to go. I'll talk about another thing that is a bit, I heard some things from other peer reviewers, and I've seen some other states do, and I'm going to talk about a state that I didn't peer review. Is Ohio here? Ohio? So, and I'm not talking out of turn. I've looked at their information that's online, and we had a similar request from some folks in the state. They wanted a breakdown by reporting category, and by reporting category were students below standard, at or near standard, or above standard. And I'll give you an example. Again, this is online. Grade 3 English Language Arts. For writing, a student who scored a 0 or 1 is below standard. A student who scored 2 or 3 is at or near standard. And a student who scored 4 to 10 is above standard. So as a person that has a working knowledge of psychometrics, that scares me. And I know also from our TAC recommended against having reported categories at all. They said you're just asking for people to use information in an inappropriate way. However, we had a policy requirement to have reporting categories. Some states have a legislative requirement. I'm not sure what Ohio's requirement is, but I'm guessing their TAC had something to say about this, but they were required to do it. But when I go into the letter, on their last peer review submission, that was not a question. It was okay. But be careful what you provide, because then the finding in Ohio's letter was, where's this information for the alternate assessment? So if you're going to do something like this and you're going to submit it for one assessment, you're probably going to be asked to submit it for all your assessments. So again, I think Ohio's Park's instructive for what works. Ohio's instructive for what works, but where there might be cautions. And again, you can look all those things up online. I'll say one more thing about Ohio. They used to do the itemized analysis. I'm guessing it's when they release test. And if you can look online, you can see from 2013 and prior, they go by grade. They have an item number, the percent of students selecting each option, and the overall p-value for that item for those release tests. So that information is there. And it is itemized score analysis, but I believe those are for the release test. So good resources for better or for worse. The stuff's out there.
And I think that in a peer review, if we get to the reporting, because we usually do these, in the order in which they're numbered, and so reporting is last. But if we see something unexpected in the report, something that maybe something like this, where there is more detail than we saw validation evidence for earlier on in the submission, then we would be going back to the earlier sections to see if that type of reporting is defensible, to see if you have provided the evidence necessary to make sure that it's not misleading or isn't has, or that make sure that it has a sufficient level of generalizability and reliability that to support that sort of reporting.
Yeah, I'd just like to remind everyone of something that Don mentioned yesterday that I think we're sort of hitting on a little bit here in the way we've been describing some of this stuff, and that is the peers have a task of going through what you as states submit, and then we cross-reference it with all the critical elements and the guidance. But it's really then the U.S. Department of Education that decides what specific things they want the state to fix. So you will not be surprised that if you go through the peer review things, that there are certain things that we as peer reviewers point out that we would normally recommend be fixed, but the U.S. Department of Education makes its own determination of what they're going to ask you as a state to correct or fix or send additional information on. The peers have no role in that type decision. Our role is to give advice to the U.S. Department of Ed, and as you all know, with any advice that you give to any policymakers or decision makers, they sometimes take your advice and they sometimes don't. And so it's always interesting for us as peer reviewers to see what, in fact, the letter then does say from the U.S. Department of Ed. And we're like, oh, well, I guess I didn't like this comment we made, and I guess I didn't like this one we made. And so it's obviously has some political tones to it. And I'll stop at that point.
Just a quick comment on that. For at least for the department, at least from my perspective, not that I'm going to comment at length at this at all. I think the department strives to meet the requirements of the law and the regulations and just alignment with policies and guidance in general. But as we all know, the law is the requirement. It's necessary, but it's not necessarily sufficient. And I think the beauty of peers is you guys provide the expertise and the knowledge and recommend where states can improve. And I think that's why we use peers, because we want people who have deep expertise and knowledge to provide recommendations that we can see and provide to states. And in terms of meeting the requirements of the law and regulations, I think sometimes it may go beyond what's specifically found in the law or in the regs. So we strive to keep close to those. So moving on to, I guess we talked about, in general, what you see in submissions. Is there anything else that you would recommend or anything else that you have to share with the public before we open it up to questions? No? Open up to questions? Okay, great. So if we have questions, please step up to the microphone, identify yourself, and go right ahead. Yes.
My question is for Lou.
Come on, Harold, open it
First-
up to everyone.
Oh, my name is Harold. I'm with AIR. And so first, Lou, I am grateful because every time I hear you talk, we learn so much. You've been doing this a long time, so thank you. You said something at the beginning, help the peers understand the big picture. And I come at this from the vendor perspective, and I see some of the critical elements as things that are vendor responsibilities and other things that are state responsibilities. And I wonder, in this critical element or more broadly, what are examples of things that kept you from seeing the big picture? It was a formatting issue or a documentation issue. And what are some other examples of things that were very easy for you to see the big picture, whether that's formatting, or how the state submitted? I wonder if you could give two extreme examples, something that really worked, something that didn't work, maybe from the vendor perspective or the state perspective.
Thank you, Harold. I guess I'm coming at it from the standpoint of having a better picture of who the vendor is that the state uses in their testing program. I mean, who's developing the items, who's doing all of that work. Obviously, if the state is part of a consortium, that's usually mentioned, but we don't usually get a sense of who's operating this thing, And that's what I'm calling the big picture. Does anybody else want to add to that?
And I would just say, as I mentioned before, this is one area where the vendor may print and produce the reports, but the vendor's producing what the state tells them, and the state's producing what the legislators and policymakers are telling them. And you know, our vendors, they're both in the room, they're both represented here, have done their due diligence in warning us about some of the concerns, and our TAC has as well. But again, at the end of the day, policy and legislation drive what goes on those reports. And again, it's important for peers to understand that. And I think we have, and you may say something that I wouldn't have done this, but you've explained it, and I, as a peer, would approve. I would approve it because you've explained why we're seeing what we're seeing.
Yeah, of course.
So, Vince, you're not as old as Lou or I, but your comments are every bit as instructive. I'm Steve Ferrara from Measured Progress. Vince, I was very much interested in what you said about live links on the parent reports that they can follow to get additional information. Do you have any data on use and usefulness of the live links? Or do you know of any other states that have data like that?
That's a great question. We could easily find out the kind of traffic that we're getting. No, we don't. I mean, it's the anecdotal data. It's the things that we get questions on. I would say in our office, and Catherine Altmeier's here, and she and her team, she has a team of one. But our office works to answer questions. And the good thing is when we do get those questions, we think we have the resources that exactly answer their questions, and we provide them. And usually we get very few follow-ups. So.
Any questions from this side of the room? We have a lot of time. Oh, Bob.
I'm Rob Bauer from North Dakota. What about states that are considering the local option to use a nationally recognized assessment? I know other states are already using ACT or SAT, so they have their own reporting systems and reporting mechanisms, and these reports go out to the students and parents. So what, in addition to what they're already providing, would be required under peer review for reporting? And would those additional reports, if they're required, make it confusing to parents?
Yeah, wasn't that locally selected, nationally recognized assessment? That's a great question. I don't think that there's anything in the guidance that really helps the state with that yet. You know, you would, it's something you'd probably want to talk to the department about, and definitely your TAC. You know, you mentioned having standard setting in North Dakota. You set standards on ACT, and then also on your state tests. And then deciding, I think part of it is with your stakeholders, how does this fit in your accountability system? What do you need parents and districts and educators to know about the comparability of results, or, you know, the cautions and concerns? So I think it's the end use. How are those scores going to be used in their state? And then are you conveying that to the educators? So I think a TAC discussion, maybe your task force of panelists, you know, users, and then a discussion with the department as to what those reports look like.
And also, as Deborah mentioned yesterday, if you are interested in that, please feel free to reach out to Deborah. There are very specific requirements and in a certain order that they must be done. So thank you. Yes.
Nancy Godfrey from Maine. The evidence for reporting that you're looking for, digging down deep into the subscores, sub-subscores, reporting categories. If we do not, because of our suppression rules in our state, report that kind of detail to the public, is it sufficient for us to give you our business rules and say this is what is suppressed? Or because we have that data anyway, we know what it is on the back end, are we supposed to give that to you because you're top secret? No.
But describe exactly why you don't do what you're not doing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Again, this is part of another area that we looked at in the validity and reliability. There is, again, I can't say the state and I can't say the cell size, but there were huge, no. So 49 others to pick from. There was a state that had a really rather large cell size for suppression, and the peer reviewers and the department says we talked about it, and some folks were of the mind of that cell size is way too big. But they reported the cell size, and that was their choice for whatever reason, and they suppressed data below that, although you might have been able to report at a higher level. They gave it, and I think after lots of discussion, they met the requirement, because they and that knowing that cell size was important, was helpful.
And as with cell sizes and other aspects of meeting this critical element or other critical elements, if you have a justification in the form of, we had a discussion with our TAC and this is what they said, I've seen that be very influential in during the peer review process, that you consulted on that issue. And this is what your technical advisory committee advised you.
And I would just add to what Will just said. It's don't just say we had a discussion with our TAC. I mean, be specific in terms of on such and such a day, and you could even maybe submit an agenda for that particular meeting to show that yes, that was an item of discussion. Those kinds of things. As much as we would like to just say, well, the state said they did this, it's supposed to be evidence-based. And just saying you did it doesn't mean it happened. So give us something to look at, or you get what I'm saying.
Good morning. I'm Pam Denton. I'm new to the state of Rhode Island. I was wondering how reporting of participation rates were included or not included in this critical element.
No, I don't think that ever came up in discussion in 6.4.
No, it's not 6.4. But isn't there a place where they do send in their participation stuff? Or is that?
Yeah, that's one of the sections the feds look at.
Department of Ed does the analysis.
Got it. Thank you.
Not
But there is this critical element includes the percent of students not tested. That's
Number of
on the
percent.
report
On
card.
the percentage.
Yeah,
On the state report card.
right. So that's, if I could have the numbers.
Yeah, the state report card's another interesting entity, because it is required, and again, it's this business of, you're not supposed to be using links, but, how do you demonstrate that you've got a state report card? Well, go to the site and there it is. I mean, unless you just do a print screen of the landing page for your state report card. But then there are some other things that I think are specifically mentioned as far as the percentages of kids at the different achievement levels, and sort of you just submit print screens for that. So this might be another area where I think the U.S. Department of Ed needs to think through it. One of the other reasons why I think links are sometimes problematic is I've had it happen where you clicked on the link and it took you to a page where you were supposed to say, what city you were from, and we're supposed to be unidentified peer reviewers for a specific state. But if you're having to log in or provide some information, then that makes it a little bit questionable.
Good morning, John Olson, independent assessment consultant. You really need the names of my companies? No.
Preferred, but
So a number of states that have adopted the next-gen science standards are redesigning their science assessments to measure these complex design that the standards have, and 3 dimensions and all that. And some of these states are using cluster-based item design in their tests, but they're also being pressured to keep the amount of testing time down to a minimum. So in discussions with some of these states, they're saying, we're not sure what we're going to be able to report just yet. And some of it is just sort of trying to be figured out as things go along, limitations of numbers of items in this, because these cluster-based designs are different, if you're familiar with them. So when a state submits on their science assessment, is there a minimum expectation in peer review on what is reported? For example, I've talked to some states, they said, well, we'll report a total science score. We're not sure what subscores we can report just yet. We're not sure if we can report information by science discipline. So what would be advice, or what would be expectations that you would want to see in the science reports?
From a state who is waiting until everybody else adopts the next generation science standards, I think I still can answer this because I've seen it, as I mentioned, with some of the provisional reports that we've seen. So you have to submit, right? So you're going to submit something, and I think, like I've seen with other states, you're going to say, here's what we reported, here are our plans for further research, and here's what we're going to go to our TAC at this date. We'll go to a panel of experts or standard setting at this date, a timeline, and then when you think you're gonna submit a report that's going to meet the requirements. So you're just it'll basically be an incomplete, but I think it's important that you have a plan.
We had one question in the back. Nope, I'm making that up. Any pitfalls in terms of what you see in submissions that must not do or must do, things that you should see in evidence?
We've hit all the bases.
You've hit everything. Anything else you want to share?
There's a lot of overlap among these sessions in terms of the things that we're all saying you all should do. Organization of your materials is very important. Maybe having somebody outside of your area looking at what you've pulled together to see if it makes sense to them. Do double checking of page references in some of the documents. I had it happen once where we were told to go to page 25 when it was supposed to be page 52, so somebody transposed the page numbers. All of those things are important, and the thing that we stressed a lot in the session yesterday on organizing all of your materials is you can't do it at the last minute. If you think you're going to be able to pull together your peer review stuff in a month or 2 months, you're going to be. We will know it as peer reviewers when you get it. We'll know it, and so don't do that. You need to be working on it already, and as Tammy mentioned, as you go through the test development process, your team needs to be aware of what are the peer review requirements. Are we keeping track of the item reviewers and their backgrounds and all of those kinds of things that you're going to need for peer review. So I think the same thing is true of your reporting requirements. Giving a little background on how you came about to make your decisions, or those types of things would be very helpful. But start working on it now. The spring of 2019 is going to be here before you know it.
And I'd say I mentioned looking at other states. Some of you who may be new to the assessment world and you don't have a broad base of contacts in other states, again, go out there, look at all the decision letters, and I think having the peer review notes as well For states that have met or are still lacking, you'll see where they're lacking, and then you can, so those are public, and then you can go to the state's websites. Most states that I've seen have really good reporting, sample reports and interpreter products that are readily available. So go take a look out there and see what's worked for other folks. And then if you don't feel comfortable, if you can't navigate or you have a question that you don't see, then I mentioned other sessions, CCSSO, email Scott Norton and pose your question. If it's something that you just simply can't find and you think is not a big ask of other states, let them ask for you and you should be able to get the answer.